Welcome to another episode of Living with Purpose. And I have with me Sayu Bhojwani, who is a friend, a colleague who I've known since the mid 1990s when she was at the Asia Society and I was doing some work for them on a conference in Jakarta. And since then has just a phenomenal career being a social entrepreneur where she's launched a number of different nonprofit organizations. She's served in the Bloomberg administration as the Commissioner of Immigrant Rights. She has worked at the Bloomberg Foundation. She's an author, and she's going to talk about that. She started this new American Leaders Initiative, which is actually promoting people, particularly coming from other parts of the world. With that, Sayu, welcome to Living with Purpose.
Thank you. It's great to be here to see this evolution of your work over the years, Hector.
Thank you. You were born in Belize.
No, I was born in India, but
You were born in India when your parents moved to Belize.
Yes, when I was 4. So Belize, when I think about home, which is a complicated concept, I think of Belize, not so much of India. Even though I feel very connected to India, but Belize is the place that I consider, that's my childhood home.
Right. So talk about that journey from growing up in a small country to coming to one of the largest cities in the world and then making that as your home and going through this awesome journey that you've had from being at a society that is focused on Asia and art and culture and politics to now a Soros fellow.
I would say, like, growing up in Belize, which is a multiracial democracy, it's like this odd, it's a bit of an anomaly because it feels very Caribbean, at least the part where I grew up, but it's in Central America and it's the only English speaking country in the region and a former British colony. So my parents moved from a former British colony to another British colony. And while we were living there, it became independent. So I start with that because I often think that my professional journey is very tied to having grown up in a multiracial democracy and to having grown up as an outsider. And so when I got to New York, what was beautiful about New York is that you don't really feel like on a day-to-day basis walking around New York, everyone feels welcome. Now, obviously, that's not the case when you go look for jobs or apply to schools even. But on the surface, when I got to New York, I thought, oh, this is another home. And I've lived here. I've lived in New York for 30 years. So I think it is a place that welcomes difference. But having been Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs, I know that it's not a place that's always welcoming to everyone. So I got to New York. You met me at the Asia Society. But the role that I was in at the Asia Society was working with Asian American communities. And I think one of the big challenges for me when I moved to New York was to try to understand where I, as a South Asian, fit in this landscape. Because this was the early 90s. There were not as many South Asians in New York. We weren't as visible as we are now. And people still don't know where to place South Asians in this kind of easy category, which I say easy, it's easy for people who are categorized. It is a set of categories that are used very frequently in the US: Black, Latino, white, Asian American. And so my journey at the Asia Society, being a South Asian American, was kind of the next big influencer of my work. And I think that's been the path that I've been on for all those years, like understanding what it means to be a South Asian in the racial landscape of the US. I first started an organization for South Asian youth. Then I became the Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs. And then I worked for Mayor Bloomberg in a number of different capacities. And then in 2010, I started New American Leaders, which is for first generation immigrants to run for public office. I think all of that was about my own personal journey as well of belonging and seeking a place that felt, seeking a political home in addition to, what we often think of as our physical, became a political home for me and for hundreds of people that we trained.
Talk about also just a little bit about your book, right? People like us. I mean, what
Sure.
motivated you to write that? And what was the central thesis that you were trying to articulate in the book?
That's a great question. I'm really glad that you asked that. So going back to when I was commissioner, I got appointed commissioner of immigrant affairs about 15 months after I became a US citizen and about 6 months after the September 11 attacks. So for listeners to imagine that I, as a South Asian, my father was born in what is now Pakistan. I come from a community of displaced people, and I had worked with young South Asian boys and girls. And then I became the commissioner. I became the face of the mayor to immigrant communities. So, what was incredibly powerful about that is that it wasn't just that they had appointed an immigrant and a woman of color, but they had appointed someone whose fathers and brothers and uncles looked like what had become the face of terrorism in New York City and in the country. And that was an incredibly powerful moment for me to understand what it meant to have someone like me in a position of power. And it's that experience that led me to start New American Leaders. So when I was running New American Leaders, what we were saying is that people like us would be the ones that would create the kind of policies that would be more inclusive and responsive to the full diversity of Americans. But what we were finding is that we were operating, or they who were getting elected, were operating in systems that were not designed for us. And so the book came about as a way of identifying the challenges within our system that need to be changed in order for us to have legislatures that look like America. And I'm going to give one very specific example that to me is one of the most powerful examples of why, if you go and look at all the state legislatures, which are feeders to Congress, why they look the way they do. Why do they look older and male and white? And it's because the entire structure of state legislatures was designed for an agrarian society. And so the idea was that during the opposite of harvest time, you would go to the legislature and you would make laws. And so the people who were making laws were people who were independently well off, had mostly were farmers or owners of plantations, and were going off to make laws for 40 days of the year. That is an unsustainable system for the America of today. So literally that system still exists in Georgia, still exists in Montana, it still exists in Arizona. That you are expected to serve in the legislature for what is considered part time. But actually, in today's America, that is a full time job. But it's a full time job that pays 14,000 in Georgia and 24,000 in Arizona. That's like the numbers the last time I looked at them. So you can imagine maybe you, Akhtar, and I could go and serve in the legislature and just spend 40 days a year and then come back and teach, or come back and be lawyers, or come back and run our real estate business. But the nature of that system is what results in certain types of people being able to run and serve. Like if you're a teacher, not a university teacher, but if you're a public school teacher, you're not going to take 40 days out of the year and go and make laws. And actually, you get paid more as a public school teacher than you get paid as a legislator in Georgia. And so I wrote the book. That was just one example that I wanted to explain, because to me, it's the starkest example of why the only certain types of people are able to afford to run. And the book describes the stories of many people who ran for office, overcame some of those systemic obstacles, or were blocked by those systemic obstacles.
So, to fast forward a little bit, you've done a lot of work in the communities, right? I mean, you've traveled the nation, you've kind of talked to people, you've looked at different ways in which you have been getting people to show up in some ways, right? I mean, you're essentially asking people that just want to come and just work and assimilate and not raise their heads to actually raise their heads and show up. And you started doing a lot of this work with young people. Where do you see how has that energy changed? I'm seeing it in my students at the university, but I'd love to hear from you.
I mean, I think in a way, the journey that I went on with the organizations is the journey that a lot of people of color have gone on. Like I started with direct service. These are the services that young people need. And then I realized that, oh, actually, we would just be doing that forever if we didn't fix the policy, which is why I was open to serving as commissioner of immigrant affairs. And then I thought, well, we are the ones who need to make the policy. Now, where we are is like the whole system is a problem. So there is this tension between people who feel like we need to burn down the system. And I do think a lot of young people, not only young people, but a lot of young people feel like, well, this system is not serving me. And then people who are trying to figure out how do we work within the system to make the change. And I think that I'm more of a bridge person. I'm sort of like some days I'm like, it's enough already. And other days I'm like, who do I need to work with and what institutions I need to work with to create change? I will say, like, I think most of us who are very aware of how our democracy works and how our society works did not buy into the idea that we were in a post-racial society after Obama got elected, right?
Right.
I think we understood that that was not the case. But I think that that's now a pretty widespread understanding that the election of a person of color, the election of, for example, Vice President Kamala Harris to the presidency, I don't think is going to make a meaningful difference in immigration policy, for example. That to me is the policy that I have followed, the policies that I have followed most closely. And I don't see any indication that she or any Democratic president is going to create the kind of sweeping change that we need to fix a system that is broken and really not serving anybody. It's not serving people who are against immigrants. It's not serving people who are pro-immigrants.
Yeah. To talk just in the last minute or so about what are you doing now, and then we'll kind of move on to purpose and other questions.
I feel like I'm experimenting now. I'm writing fiction. I am doing some consulting and strategizing with women of color leaders. And I'm trying to figure out what my next big step is going to be. The Soros Fellowship is primarily focused on documenting and supporting or creating support for women leaders of color because we have been the backbone of democracy and are not actually caring for ourselves in the process. And no one really cares about us. So, that's the work that I'm doing.
Coming back to purpose. So talk about why is purpose important to you and how are you showing up with a life of purpose? I mean, I think you already kind of said that, but maybe you can encapsulate it in a more pithy way.
Well, I'll say that I spent a lot of time thinking about this over the last couple of years, and I can talk about my purpose now. When I look back at every step of the way, it has been my purpose to create spaces of belonging for people like me. That's immigrants, women of color, marginalized people. And so my purpose is, to create these spaces of belonging and to encourage people to be the boldest and bravest versions of themselves. And I live that purpose by trying to be the boldest and bravest version of myself by walking away from institutions that I have created, trusting that they will continue, by making choices that preserve my time and energy, by choosing to be grounded and thoughtful about where I spend my time rather than being on a hamster wheel.
Somebody in my class, a guest speaker, and she's also of South Asian origin, and she said that I hire people to buy back my time. That's my only way I hire somebody so that I can get my time back to do the things that I can most do. So it's actually fascinating that you are actually, and we don't really get people to focus on their time and their selves and their healing, and everything is just kind of being on a hamster wheel. So I know you've gone through some tough times in your journey. The work that you do is not easy. So, how has purpose allowed you to overcome some of these difficult times?
I mean, I'm a really determined person. I don't take no that easily for an answer. And also, I just really, over time, I didn't feel this way when I was in my 20s, but over time, I have come to believe that I'm able to see a couple of steps ahead of where we are. And so I know that part of my work is helping to get people there and convince them. So now I expect that everything I'm going to do is a little bit hard because it's a little bit, most people do not have the luxury of thinking into the future because they have to deal with whatever is in front of them.
Yeah.
And, that's not a flaw, it's just a reality. And so I think that I've grown to accept that part of my purpose, part of why I'm here is because I sort of predict what might be needed to solve something that people feel is an individual problem, but actually I see as a systemic problem.
So let's end with your sharing with us your one golden nugget, a piece of wisdom that you can leave our listeners with.
So my thing is that work will not save us. Only we will save ourselves. Like many of us come from families and communities and environments where the goal is to just work, work, work. And we're very uncomfortable being still and being silent. And I have learned through my journey that work will not save me, that I have to find my own energy and creativity in order to be able to work and live in my purpose.
This is awesome. I just love this two things that you said. Purpose is how does it create a sense of belonging? And then this, it is impossible for me to do, which you know very well, Sayu, but this notion of stillness and just at times finding a place of quiet repose, which is very hard. Just to our listeners, I was in India in August and I spent 4 days at a ashram doing meditation and yoga in Rishikesh. And it was probably one of the best times I've had in my life. I just never thought I would ever be able to do something like this. And my middle son basically forced me to go there and said, just try. If you don't like it, just walk out and go what you want to do. It was just awesome. So I do understand this notion of how we need to invest in our time. And at moments, quiet and stillness can be such powerful sources of a renewable energy that can drive us forward. So with that, Sayu, thank you so very much. And all of you, hopefully you'll join us for another episode of Living with Purpose. Thanks.
Thank you. It was great to have this conversation.